Hey everybody, welcome to Chapter 2, Game Design, Design Components and Processes. So this chapter makes it clear that now we're talking about game design, not game development. So you got to kind of separate the two. In game development, I'm actually creating the game. In design, I'm thinking through how the game's going to work. I'm planning the game. All right, objectives for this, you can kind of read those yourself. So your book talks about, is it art, is it engineering, is it craft, and it says game design is a craft. It can be learned, anybody can create it, but can anybody create a great one or a good game? I don't think so. I think it's a little bit of everything. Excuse me. I can teach somebody to paint, but that doesn't mean they can paint great, or like Picasso or that kind of stuff. But I can teach people to make a craft like a chair, and they can probably make a relatively good chair. So like for me, game design is a little bit of everything. But I digress. Alright, so the player-centric approach. Now we're talking about designing a game focused on the player. We're not designing a game for ourselves. We're not designing a game to be the opponent. We're designing a game for a person. And we have that one specific person in mind. And everything is built around here. We need to get an emotional response out of this person. So if I was going to create a Barbie game, my player-centric approach would be, maybe an 8-year-old girl. And I would think, hey, I want to make this 8-year-old girl think that, she can be beautiful by putting on clothes and doing hair and doing makeup and stuff like that. So that's the kind of response I might want to generate. So that's what I start with, and I kind of focus on that when I make the game. How do I make this little girl think that she's pretty and making and doing makeup and stuff like that into my game? So other methods, the market-driven games, and this is what we kind of have now. When Minecraft came out and became a huge success, now we have a ton of block games. When World of Warcraft came out and it was huge, and people saw just how big an MMO could be. Now we have all these different theme park MMOs that really copy just really World of Warcraft. So we typically don't want to do market-driven games. They obviously aren't as successful as the original, and there's no way you can appeal to everybody. Designer-driven games are typically disasters. The designer says, hey, I'm going to have all creative control, and I'm going to be a part of every frickin' decision of the game. If you get a chance, there's a link in your folder for this week that says about the train wreck at the bottom of the materials folder. There was a guy, John Romero, and he was huge in games. Some of the biggest games that kind of brought gaming into the mainstream were Doom, Quake, and Wolfenstein 3D. Up till that point, only a few people played games at colleges and things like that on those kind of things. And we really didn't have any super fun games that everybody was playing or that you could play together. And then Doom and then Quake came out. We had multiplayer tournaments and championship games, and it was huge. And John Romero was the lead guy and all that. And anyway, his head got really big. He left his studio, started his own studio, decided to create his own. Hey, I'm going to make a first-person shooter game that I want. This is what everybody's going to want. Blah 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 blah. Terrible marketing. I mean, at this time, he was the biggest guy in gaming. Anybody that had ever played a video game knew who John Romero was. And then he had all kinds of ads like John Romero is going to make you his biatch and that kind of stuff. And everybody was really looking forward to this game. But he had very unrealistic plans for the game. His design was terrible. He thought he was going to do in 7 months with 7 people what the game company he had been at did in 9 months with 9 people. And his people weren't like industry experts. They were all like people that he had kind of picked up that had some talent because they were designing levels and stuff in his games. Anyway, he released this game called Daikatana. It initially was slotted for a 97 release. So 1997 at Christmas was when he was going to release it. And so many delays and so many rewrites and things like that. The game eventually was not released until 2000. So by that time, everybody was like, yeah, we're not really expecting a whole lot because it's already been 3 years from the time you told us it was going to be out. And then when the game was released, it was terrible. Still listed in Games Radar as one of the worst games of all time. And his career just went down the toilet. So that's designer-driven games. Don't do that. Games for a specific license. Whenever a new movie comes out, like Lord of the Rings or a Disney movie like Frozen, they always have a video game with that. And sadly, most of the time, those video games suck. And the reason is you have to wait until you kind of see parts of the movie, the background, the characters, that kind of thing, before you can make the game. Like, you can make it like a rough idea of the game, you can make a prototype, but you can't do any art assets and things like that and bring it all together until you see a large portion of the movie. And because of that, then you don't have a lot of time. Once that large portion of the movie is done, that movie is probably going to be produced and out in the next year. So you only have like a year left to make your video game. So that's why these games typically, they're just cash-ins on the licensing. So technology-driven games are built to show the latest technology. Art-driven games show cool artwork. So things to consider when you're designing a game, you have to have a specific vision. What emotional response do I want to get from the player? Who is the player? What do they like? What do they want to do? And then, is technology able to do this? There's a guy, Derek Smart, who I really can't stand as a game developer, but he has made some interesting games years ago. Battle Cruiser 3000 AD, a couple of ones. He has a great vision. Hey, I want to make a game where I can do like all kind of things on his spaceship and send probes and land on planets and visit aliens, but the technology just wasn't there, and his games were lackluster at best, full of bugs, terrible, and the guy still has a really big head because he has some money. But anyway, and then you have to consider your aesthetic style. Games like World of Warcraft have cartoony graphics. Is that going to take away from your player interaction? Like WildStar was just released last year. WildStar has cartoony graphics, and a lot of people didn't like WildStar just because of the graphics, where games like ArcAge and Terra, have very realistic kind of graphics and are the kind of the same type of games. All right, your textbook talks about the core mechanics. Core mechanics are the things in the background. What's the chance of somebody blocking an attack? What's the chance of me hitting with an attack? What are my spells? What kind of damage do they do? That kind of stuff. So the more your core mechanics are realistic, they say the. All right, let me rephrase that. Your core mechanics determine how realistic the game world seems. But do you really want your game world to be realistic? Most people play games to get away from the real world. So with your core mechanics, if I can jump 60 feet in the air, that's not very realistic. But it could be a lot of fun. All right, and then the user interface. People that design user interfaces, really that's almost a job in itself, and you can actually get a job at a game company just designing user interfaces. And here's one example. When DC Universe Online came out on the PC, the interface was originally created for a console game like the Xbox One or the PlayStation 4, the game controllers. Those interfaces in those games have a different interface than PC games. Well, when the PC users got that user interface, they hated it. So the game did terrible on PC, but was awesome on the console games. A lot of people just dropped the game on their PC and just played it on their console because it was the user interface was so much more intuitive on the consoles. So the user interface is what the user sees. Do I see a health bar? Do I see a mini map? Do I see my damage when I'm doing an attack? What kind of animation do I see in my person? That kind of stuff. So we can talk about interaction. What does the user see? Do I see an avatar? Do I see my character? Or am I multi-present, like in games like Rome Total War, where I can see all the different towns and I can be kind of everywhere at once? Is my camera model a first-person or a third-person shooter? In first-person shooter, you're seeing through the eyes of your character, but in third-person, you're kind of like behind your character, and you can see your character from the back and do stuff like that. A lot of games now allow you to switch between first and third person because different people prefer it different ways. If I only make a first-person shooter and you can only be in first person, then I kind of eliminated all the sales I would have gotten from those people that enjoy third person. So it's best to kind of incorporate both of those models. All right, the textbook also talks about the structure of a game is composed of gameplay modes and then shell menus. So gameplay modes are when you can actually interact with the game world. I'm running around, I'm killing some pigs, I'm doing weird stuff, that kind of stuff. And then shell menus are when you're not interacting in a game. I'm saving the game, I'm going in and changing the settings. A shell menu can also almost be considered as a cutscene. If you ever played Star Wars: The Old Republic, it's a free-to-play MMO, and your class, like let's say I'm the Jedi Knight, you have a story. And different points in the game cuts out and you can no longer interact with the world, but a story comes up and you kind of see what's going on, but you can't interact with it. Other than actually on that part, you can do different voice choices or whatever, but you get the idea. And then you go back to the story and you can actually play the game. So the game mode plus the shell menus, equal the structure of the game. All right. In the design process, remember, we're not talking about development, we're talking about design. You've got 3 stages that your book talks about: the concept stage, elaboration, and tuning stage. So the concept stage is when I decide who am I writing this game for and what emotional response do I want to get out of that person. Do I want them to, am I building a first-person shooter for, a teenage boy that's going to be exciting and fast-paced? Or am I going to make a Barbie game that's going to be designed for an 8-year-old girl that's going to make her self-esteem improved and make her feel good about herself? So once that concept is done, we need to focus and stay on that concept and not change it. There are some examples of video games that make a change to the concept halfway through development and then release, and they're not hitting it. Because they were originally designed to make be a horror game, and then they realized the game just wasn't horrible, or created wasn't scary enough. So then they try to make it funny. If you've ever seen that movie, is it Sliver? Something like that, where these little things like little slugs kind of run and get into people. That was originally made to be a horror movie, but then they kind of changed the concept halfway through and kind of made it a comedy. So it's kind of a comedy horror movie that kind of most people, it's average at best. All right, elaboration stage. Here's where I actually do the designing. What's the player going to look like? What's the primary mode? Is it going to be first person, third person, that kind of stuff? What's the world going to look like? What are my core mechanics? What kind of attacks is this person going to have? And this is where I write the story. Here's what's going to happen in the game. And then I do fine tuning. Now I need to put in some better graphics, and fix this. And then, hey, this wasn't quite as fun. Maybe I can change it this way. Or I don't like the small shield that or maybe my player had a big shield and it blocked a lot of the view. So now I make it small. So, I'm just fine. I'm polishing at this point. All right. Lots of different roles in game design. You can be a lead designer, a game designer, a level designer, things like that. A lot of these bigger game companies actually hire people out in the real world based on work that they've done. I know Valve does this a lot. They have hired people that have made different levels in their games. There was a guy that was making campaigns for, was it Left 4 Dead or Left 4 Dead 2? He was making these campaigns, and some of them were really good and topping the charts. And Valve actually found out who he was and called him and offered him a job. So there's a lot of stories like that, and a lot of these bigger companies now it's so tight looking for talent that they're actually on the net and these YouTube channels and stuff looking for people that are making different things in different levels, different mods, that kind of stuff, and they're actually hiring them in. Squad, makers of Kerbal Space Program, just hired one of their mod makers. Some guy had made a really nice mod. Everybody was downloading it, and it was really cool. And they actually found who the guy was, called him up, and offered him a job. But you can be a writer, an interface designer, an art person, a music person. Obviously all video games need music. They need sound effects, that kind of stuff. All right, then there's the design document that your book talks about. Most of the time, your design document is used to kind of map out the game. Here's the game that we intend to make, and here's how it's going to work. Now, your book talks about some other ways to do design documents, but if you go to Google and you type in, video game design documents, you'll find they're typically designed around the entire game. They're not typically sales tools. But you can do that. So what they're talking about is high concept and then these game treatment documents, and these are smaller summaries that are used to sell your game. So let's say I want to design a game that's a first-person shooter and blah, blah. So I'll write up 2 to 4 pages of what the game is going to be about and how it's going to work. And then I'll submit it to these game publishers to see if they'll buy it. And if they will, then they hire me and I come on and I design the game, that kind of stuff. So there's also character design documents where we design the character. There's world design documents where we decide the world. Remember, when we talk about just the world, you know, what's the maps going to look like? What are the buildings going to look like? Are there going to be NPCs in the world? Are the NPCs going to talk? Are they going to be interactive? Are they going to move? So a lot of stuff just in world design. All right, and then flow boards. Typically when we see flow boards, we think about animation like Disney Pixar. You know, when they create a story like, you know, Toy Story or Frozen, you know, they create a storyboard first. Here's how the movie's going to start, and then this character is going to be introduced, and then this happens, and then this is going to cause this to happen, that kind of stuff. So that's a flow board. It's kind of like a flow chart for how the game's going to work. Then there's a story and level progression. You know, how is the player going to progress in the story? What levels they're going to do, and that kind of stuff. All right, so anatomy of a game designer, skills most useful for professional game designers. Imagination obviously is a big one. You know, school tends to suck this out of us, but a few people actually get through high school and stuff and still have some of that intact. Make sure you understand, you know, what is available technically. A lot of people have these great big ideas about games, but the technology just quite isn't there yet. And then they talk about analytical, mathematical, anesthetic, that kind of stuff. But drawing, writing, really, as a game designer, you kind of need to be a jack of all trades. Have a little bit of skill in everything. All right, so as far as the wrap-up, player-centric approaches to game design are typically the most successful. Think about you know, the kind of game you want to make, who it's going to be made towards, and what emotional response you want to draw out of that person. And then make a game focused on that and don't change it. Remember, you're not going to make a game that you like. Every game that you make, you're not going to like. You have to focus on the player. Who's going to play my game? And then once you have that part down, then you can kind of design the rest of your game. All right, let's talk about Angel and what you guys are going to do this week. All right, in your week 2 folder, words from the instructor, the slides. There's an interview with Ernest Adams, the publisher of the book, at a games conference. There's a couple other links that they want you to check out. And then there's the Game of Sutra salary survey. This is kind of neat. The only problem is the 2015 I can't find yet. So I can only find the 2014, which interviews them for 2013. So really it's about 2 years old. But this gives you an idea of some of the average salaries of these different jobs, the level of education you need, types of benefits that they offer, that kind of stuff. So game designers, producers, audio, Q&A, business management, but there's also an indie report where they talk about indie developers and that kind of stuff. And what's neat is indie developers that work alone tend to only average about $12,000 a year from their video games, where indie developers that work as part of a team tend to average $50,000, which is neat. And the reason behind that is if you're a solo guy and you're going to make a video game, you can't do everything. You know, it's hard to be able to write, art, code, market, all that stuff for your video game. But if I work as part of a 4-man team, you know, we can have an artist, a coder, a marketing guy, and a designer. And we can kind of hit more of those different things and make our game more successful. So that was kind of neat when I found that out. So that's in there under materials. There's also kind of the wiki on Daikatana. So if you go to this wiki page, again, it talks about John Carmack and all the things that plagued the game and how it was released. And actually, even in 2014, Games Radar ranked it as one of the worst games of all times. All right, and then if you go to assignments, one's about career opportunities where you got to submit a Word document. But basically, find a job you think would fit your style. You know, what you like to do and what you're good at. Describe the job, what kind of duties you think would be in that job, the requirements, salary. So you have to look all this stuff up, and then write it up in a Word document and submit it. Then there's the quiz, and then there's the game discussion. Now, I don't remember anywhere in the text of this chapter talking that sandbox games are not considered interactive. So I don't know where that comes from. But basically what you're going to do is you're going to look at my first post and you're going to answer these questions. Hey, do you agree that sandbox games are not interactive? Do you think players enjoy these types of games? And do you play any of these games that you would consider sandbox, and what are they? So sandbox games, if you don't know, sandbox games are games that have a lot of sand, a lot of stuff, and then you kind of build your own. So Minecraft would be one. When you're dropped into Minecraft, you're not given anything to do. You can go do whatever you want to do. And there's no right way to play Minecraft. EVE Online is the same way. It's a big sandbox, but with thousands of players. And you can go explore wormholes, explore different systems. You can go fight pirates. You can start your own corporation. You can be a trader. You can haul stuff for people and make money. You can form a huge galactic corporation and try to take space from other people. So there's a lot of sand, a lot of different things to do, but you don't have to do anything. There is no level progression. There are no quests, that kind of stuff. You just dropped into a world and said, here you go, here's the sand, make the game, do what you want to do. So that's a sandbox game. So post, obviously reply to my post and follow the forum guidelines, and you're all set. All right, I think that about wraps it up. Remember, if you have any questions, make sure that you email me and let me know. Other than that, we'll see you next week.